All right, we're back with another episode. I got Steve with me, and we're going to actually just drop into something that's relatively recent between the last episode and now. Dr. Zelenko has been suspended. Vladimir Zelenko. He was the man responsible, basically, for, aside from Donald Trump, responsible for popularizing the hydroxychloroquine treatment and regimen that I think had chlorocidin, high-dose zinc, and vitamin C, a couple other things. I couldn't say right off the top of my head.
I thought it was like zinc, azithromycin, and hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, it was azithromycin,
right.
Or if that was unavailable, chlorocidin.
Maybe that's the case, but like the premise was that the zinc would act as a way to get the HCQ, which is hydroxychloroquine. I'm just going to call it HCQ because I don't want to pronounce that name every single time I say it. But zinc would act as a gateway to allow the drug into the cells, which would interrupt the cellular replication of the virus. And then you'd do the azithromycin, which would, it's an antibiotic. And the principal purpose of it was to basically limit the additional respiratory infections that can occur, especially in the patients who are most vulnerable at the time that they're taking this stuff. So that was kind of what it was this combination of really cheap drugs that produced an effect. And then, Trump opened his mouth, and of course, everything that Trump says is wrong, because, he can't possibly be informed by the best advisor the country has. He was literally just citing a, what was it? Was it a Tech Raptor or a Tech Crunch article or something like that?
I can't say offhand, but I mean, that sounds right.
But this is something like that, Tech something or other article. And, we went in for a few months of the media actively combating him, journal articles coming out and trying to prove that hydroxychloroquine was really dangerous. All of which ended up getting retracted.
Heart explode,
Yeah,
like
all of which ended up getting retracted.
Yeah.
All of them. Like I've never seen you get retractions are extremely rare in the scientific literature. You're generally allowed to correct it, but they literally made up their data, and there was no evidence that anything that they used was legitimate. But all it did was kill this hydroxychloroquine stuff. And so Zelenko was the first doctor who proposed this combination. And what he said is you have to administer it very early in the treatment. And so what you had was you'd have studies that would do it as a last resort, right? They've been put on a respirator. We've given them every other drug. They're on death's door, and now we're going to give them this thing, and then all of a sudden we get some problems. And instead of doing the original treatment protocol was they've first been admitted to the hospital, we give it to them early before they get on a respirator, and it produces an effect. Now, I ultimately, where I stand on this is I can't prove or disprove any of the claims associated with it because there is so much misinformation surrounding this thing on both sides, right, that you can't get a good beat on what the truth is. But I will say that the American Medical Association has now retracted their previous statement on hydroxychloroquine.
Mind you, they haven't been very public about it, but yes, they have changed their information on that.
Their HCQ is dangerous, blah, blah, blah statement has been revised to maybe it can be used in certain circumstances. And, I know that we, a few weeks ago, Craig's on here touting the wonderful benefits of this very questionable vaccine. But, for me, where I draw my skepticism is fundamentally the biopharmaceutical industry is the lowest replication success rate of all industries, right? So psychology I've ripped into in the past, and they're at something like a 60 to 80% replication failure rate. It is much more likely that if you take a psych study and you decided to say, hey, this is wrong, you're more likely to be correct than you are to be wrong in that statement. Just on any psych study, because they're there. In the case of pharma stuff, and technically it's more specific for oncology drugs, but there is such a huge profit incentive that it's like a 90% replication failure rate. They front load all of their studies with cherry-picked participants all the way up so when we start talking about these things and having like the FDA come out and say, hey, we're going to have a 20-year study on this drug, The reason that they do that, as much as, there's good arguments for and against it, the reason that they do these 20-plus year studies before a drug comes to market is because nobody trusts the biopharmaceutical industry to do their shit right. Right? They handpick the people who go into surgery for numbers. They handpick the people who accept their drug for numbers. They do a whole bunch of front loading the experiment to make it look as their data look as good as possible, rather than actually treating people as they on a kind of a first come first served basis or anything more random than that.
Or in other words, consider it the same way that polling is handled.
That's probably true. Yes.
Oh, it is. I actually worked in polling, so yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, sir, do you meet this demographic and this demographic? Oh, that's great. That's great. We appreciate your time. You have a great day. Next person.
Yeah.
Hey, do you meet this demographic and this demographic? Oh, you do? Well, I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, sir.
Yep. And that is a serious problem with any of these sciences that sit there and get to pick who gets to join. Right? And it's not like, so what you see is people sitting there when they're talking about hydroxychloroquine, they wanted to see RCTs, and that's a fair comment. But keep in mind that the difference between the cost of the HCQ regimen proposed by Dr. Zelenko is like $7 to $10. That's what it costs to cure COVID, according to Dr. Zelenko.
Over the course of about 5 days, if I'm not mistaken, as well.
Something like that, yeah. It's like $7 to $10. You take this stuff, and that's how much money was there, because it was all over-the-counter stuff except for HCQ. HCQ is a drug that's been developed for, 70 years? Something like that?
70 years.
60, 70 years. So it's way out of patent. There are generics up the wazoo. It just doesn't have, it is so cheap to make that we just don't generally use it outside of a couple, rare diseases in the United States. I think one of them was lupus and some of the others there. So we don't have a lot of that stuff on supply. Meanwhile, if you want to go for the treatment regimen that President Trump had, it was remdesivir and a bunch of other drugs. And so we're talking about a cost of roughly about $700 for a course of therapy just for the drugs alone, versus
I think you're
$7.
Underselling that significantly.
I might be.
I understand. I believe the remdesivir is something like $3,000 a dose.
Oh, maybe I'm thinking $700 per dose and like $3,000 or $4,000 for a course.
No, that could be the possibility. I know it is not cheap. It's up there with high-level cancer drugs.
Yeah. Either way, we're talking about $7 to $10 versus a multi-fold percentage increase.
We're talking about at least adding 2 whole zeros to the thing.
Right. And as much as, in a previous episode, so the people aren't sitting there and saying Steve said 2 different contradictory things, even though I will absolutely defend the cost of biopharmaceuticals, that's based on the cost to do the research, the cost to purify the substance, the actual equipment, all those other things. That has a definite cost, and that's why it's not, $5 for all of these drugs, even though the raw materials are. But when we start talking about the difference between HCQ, which is way out of patent and way out of profit, and if it was just as effective as remdesivir or any of the rest of them, it would be just basically a death knell to the biopharmaceutical industry, because they could produce this stuff en masse. It's a salt, first off. HCQ is a salt, which means its chemical processing is a lot easier than more advanced drugs like remdesivir. And, it's not as proprietary as remdesivir. But that's kind of the cost thing that was...
Oh, yeah, long
Right. So when we start talking about these things like the modern biopharmaceutical drugs, which are, meant to address COVID-19, every biopharma company that is in business right now is attempting to address COVID-19. And the reason is there is a shitload of money in it. If you turn around and you do the mRNA vaccines, which aren't really vaccines, at least in my personal opinion, a vaccine
scientific stance, they really aren't. It is, it's something. It's something we don't even really have a word for. I mean, you could say it's kind of an injected genetic modification. I mean, that's not really accurate. That's about as accurate as saying it's a vaccine. honestly.
I talk about it as borderline gene therapy, and we should get to the point where we are developing a term that describes it, because it's very important. And this is an incredibly important technology. We could rapidly treat diseases, but I have skepticism from the biopharmaceutical industry, just because the cost-benefit curve of coming up with something that is brand new is significantly on the benefit side for the biopharma industry than using something that's 70 years old. And it's kind of a shame that what ended up like we didn't get a real study on HDQ and instead got a shitload of misinformation to make President Trump look bad. But if you don't think that the pharmaceutical industries were actively funding these things or presenting misinformation, you're in the wrong camp, because they will happily ensure that a $7 drug that cures the disease is not included in the treatment therapy, as opposed to their $3,000 cure, which costs them, $150 to make.
Oh yeah, oh of course.
But that it's a shame that he got suspended.
And that being said, there's some really, really astounding stuff in this article that I'll link here. Like chiropractic can, cure your diseases, or the one drop of hope for homeopathy, the one drop in 1,000 liters is enough to do this and that for you. But no, Dr. Zelenko, he's crossed the line.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the thing, though, right? Is we've seen social media attempt to restrict communication, and on one part of me sits there and says, I recognize what they're trying to do as a universal good, because the internet has evolved at a faster rate than we have evolved to deal with it. The downside is that you basically have gotten to the point where the people who are funding social media companies are not, like, I don't pay for Twitter, right? It's amazing that the site is free, because it's filled with the best dumpster fires this side of,
Oh yeah, the dumpster burnatorium.
Yeah, it really is. Like, it's the best dumpster fires this side of Detroit. Like, there is no better place to enjoy what you're seeing. But on the downside is that we have to keep in mind that the people who are funding Twitter and Facebook and other social media companies, YouTube, are all the same companies that have a stake in the game for all this stuff. And if that's the case, and plus you also have the political bias built in, we're not getting any realistic accounting of the information as it should be. And that's a shame.
No,
and this is just another case of that.
And on that exact note, I don't know if you've heard. If you haven't, that'll make your reaction even better. But we talked about this for just a quick second. The WHO has revised what herd immunity is. I'll actually read it to you directly. What they previously said, I'll just read the first sentence.
No, go ahead. You should read the previous one and then what it is.
Well, that's what I intend to do. So, What is herd immunity? According to the World Health Organization, as of, we'll say, December 22nd. Herd immunity is the indirect protection from infectious disease that happens when a population is immune either through vaccination or immunity developed through previous infections. This means that even people who haven't been infected or in whom an infection hasn't triggered an immune response, they are protected because people around them who are immune can act as buffers between them and an infected person, etc., etc. Now, we'll see what we have as of, we'll just call it December 24th. Herd immunity, also known as population immunity, is a concept used for vaccination, in which a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached. Herd immunity is achieved by protecting people from a virus, not exposing them to it. Read Director General's 12th October media briefing speech for more details. Now,
yep,
I'm not a physician. I just have an IT degree. But I did have to take some basic English classes, and understanding the structure of sentences as I do, I'm reading a difference there.
Well, fundamentally, they turn around and said that people, they're saying that herd immunity can't be achieved by people being infected from the disease. And that's a terrible thing, right? Because realistically, and there was also some posts recently that shows that Fauci and the rest are working back how many people have to technically be immune to the disease. But we've put vaccines as the only way to handle disease immunity within a population. Right? And there are ethics to debate about this. Is it proper to expose a population to a disease? And we have to balance costs, benefits, population impacts, and the rest, according to this disease. But what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19 is we're dealing with people who want to turn around and say, oh, you have to go get this vaccine, which has questionable safety protocols, is not going to be released en masse. And, oh, yeah, by the way, even when you take the vaccine, you're still going to have to wear a mask. You're still going to have to socially distance. You're still going to, potentially be available for reinfection and all these other things, which, traditional herd immunity, the whole point was that you'd get to a point where most people had immunity to the strain, the complex parts of the strain, and this is where Craig and I disagree, right? So traditional immunity to an inactivated virus, which is what traditional vaccines did, was multiple proteins, right? Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 10 proteins, but basically you get a complex profile of this disease, which prevents or mitigates the secondary infections.
Yeah, well, your body grows accustomed to more than just the spike protein of that particular virus. It has a few markers and kind of knows what to look for.
Right, exactly. So we expand and say, it's kind of like AI, right? You feed it a large amount of data and you train it on that data, and then it's got a much better idea going forward of other things that kind of look like this. And therefore, you generally have your immunity tends to last longer than even traditional vaccines. When we start talking about traditional vaccines versus this mRNA borderline gene therapy thing that they have that they're calling a vaccine, the reality is that is so specifically targeted that we're potentially going to run into a potential problem wherein nothing is good enough for this disease. So we start talking about some of the things like, I'm sure most people are aware that we have 2 new strains that have been developed, one in the UK and one out of Africa, and one and or both of them, you may not be protected against one or both of them if you get the vaccine. Well, what's the point of getting the vaccine?
Just cut in real quickly there and make a note that, as stated by AstraZeneca, their current vaccine would be effective against the new one. Now, take as many caveats with that as you like, but that is something that just came out today.
Yeah, I totally trust a pharmaceutical company trying to sell a drug that it will be entirely effective against newly detected strains of a disease that haven't even been realized for 2 weeks. Yeah, I'm sure there's nothing fishy in that presentation whatsoever.
No. Well, I mean, if we consider it, though, it makes sense logically if they have the same physical form, if they have that same spike protein, which they do for now. So
one does not.
Oh,
so
one of the mutations
I think
doesn't?
it's So one of them. I'm trying to remember which one is which. So I could be entirely wrong here because I know we talk about COVID on the show, but I actively spend my week not trying to deal with COVID because I have, A, bigger fish to fry, and B, more interesting fish to fry than a virus that we've been talking about since February. But when we start talking about it, I think the European strain has mutated to the point where they actually have modifications in the spike protein. And so they're not entirely sure whether the European strain will be corrected by the vaccine. The African strain, which is 70% more contagious, I don't know if they've determined whether or not the spike protein. I mean, we're talking about Africa, right? So African data is reliable in the sense that, compared to China, where China will outright lie about what its data says, African data generally isn't like that. but African data tends to be sparse and not particularly well documented. So that's kind of the difference that we have here. So we don't, if the spike protein is unchanged, they might be right against the African strain, but the UK strain, which is more deadly and has some modifications to the spike protein, I'm not sure whether the mRNA vaccine would help. But either way, this highlights the problem with such a specific and targeted approach like the mRNA vaccine, which again is not a vaccine, as opposed to dosing you with a weakened virus, which allows you to recognize multiple protein markers instead of just the one. And plus, again, like I said, and I don't want to emphasize this because it's kind of conspiracy theory for me, but at the end of the day, I see a lot of questions on fertility impacts with the vaccine. It seems to be, for whatever reason,
they are pushing the vaccine very significantly.
It comes up and they try to quash the shit out of it. But that's kind of the thing, right? The fact that it keeps on coming up, it keeps on coming up out of different quadrants of the internet, it makes me very suspicious.
Dr. Fauci himself saying, hey, if you're worried about, maybe having kids, maybe put a little bit of your junk on ice.
Right.
Are you sure about that?
Right. These are all things that are, when we start talking about the WHO changing it, it looks like they're going for, they're moving the goalposts. At the very minimum, they're moving the goalposts. But realistically, it looks like they are modifying things either for the benefit of the pharmaceutical industry or for, honestly, I don't know what. Because I just can't see why they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't make any sense why you would change herd immunity to a naturally acquired immunity to only a vaccine-specific immunity, unless maybe you're trying to convince the populace that the only way out of COVID-19 is vaccination. But that doesn't really make sense when we have the problems associated with the vaccine, and the vaccine is so narrowly targeted that even a small mutation in COVID will produce negative impacts in the efficacy of the vaccine. And, oh yeah, by the way, per what they've admitted, we don't even know if the vaccine actually works.
Well, we have heard it works against the new strains, the AstraZeneca one, so, maybe if you get the new strain, that'll be good against that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, if they just discovered something, I'm sure that they know exactly how effective it is against it. You need,
that were just discovered,
months of testing, but besides the months of testing, I'm sure that there's a strain that we discovered last week. They're perfectly confident that it'll still work. They're not trying to sell a drug. That's not what they're trying to do. They're absolutely trying to inform you properly about how this works.
They care. They care.
They care. AstraZeneca can help.
They do. Physician, heal thyself. On it. So, on the note of recently discovered things, we have out of the Jerusalem Post, UVC kills COVID-19 99.9% within 30 seconds. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not. But I could be in remembering what I said on the very first episode of this podcast about my routine of cleaning that involves UVC. And, well, would you look at that? I've dropped a link to this for you, and I'll have it in the thing as well. But, the long and short of it is 30 seconds in UVC is adequate to kill all COVID in the air. Well, not all. 99.9% in the area, and then, you'll kill another 99.9% of that with an additional minute. So you'll be getting to, an absolutely minimal level.
See, that's kind of the thing, right? When I sit there and I argue against masks, the principal reason that I'm arguing against masks is they create an environment that the virus can survive in, right? It is shielded from UV. It's got a warm, moist, constantly enriched with cellular material that is right there, whereas normally if you weren't wearing a mask, most of this stuff would just fall to the ground and it would die very quickly. viruses, and this is true for pretty much all viruses, do not survive for very long unshielded from the environment. Our environment is pretty harsh. We have, when we start talking about cellular abilities and our protections against the environment, we kind of miss it. But the reason that we have lipid layers around our DNA, the reason that we have cells in the first place, is that's the only way our DNA can actually successfully replicate without getting destroyed by UV radiation or heat or any one of 100 things that would rip this stuff apart and put it back together in different forms. Viruses have none of that protection in the outside world, so pretty much the second that you emit a virus, it starts to decay. And it dies off very, very quickly. Something like, I don't know what the half-life is of COVID-19. I've been trying to find something like that, but it can be anywhere between.
I can tell out in the open, the last I heard was something like 9 hours, which for a
half-life
virus is pretty. I don't know if that's a half-life. I think that was actually effective life. So the half-life is probably going to be something like
30 minutes, couple hours.
Yeah, like 45 minutes, an hour maybe.
Yeah, something like that. Either way, so you're still talking about your viral load dropping
now to clarify,
radically.
That is amazing. That is an incredibly stout and powerful virus.
That is absolutely true, right? So
yeah,
a lot
just
of
to
viruses,
clarify, not whitewashing this or anything here. That's amazing. It would take some really excellent Chinese technicians to engineer something like this. Not that I'm saying that happened, but that's,
There would have to. It is so. That's kind of one of the things that when we start talking about this virus and why does it spread as frequently as it does, and it seems to be not asymptomatic spread, because that's been pretty resoundingly debunked at this point. But it seems to be that it has a very high survival chance outside of the body. So I think to give you an idea of where this virus ranks in terms of like effective lifespan outside the body, AIDS, if I'm not injecting AIDS, I don't have AIDS, but if I'm not injecting AIDS into somebody directly, right, it doesn't survive, right? You go to the pool.
It requires a host of some variety.
It pretty much requires a host, which is why it only transmits through like sexual contact. And realistically, it only transmits through damaged sexual tissues.
Yeah, blood transfer, some fluid transfers.
Some.
Some.
But when you actually, if you take a look, like I think sexual transmission rates for AIDS, if a male is having sex with a female and the male has AIDS, the probability of transference to the female is like 10%, right? So there's a 10% chance if you have full-blown AIDS, your infection is active, you are everything about it. It's a 10% chance of transmission to another person, right? So it really requires basically super spreaders who are, either using drugs or, jizzing up all over everything to get a move on. The reverse is not true, right? So if a male has sex with a female who has AIDS, it's something like 1%. And so this is what we have long considered as like the death knell of society, and it basically does not survive outside of a host. There are a handful of viruses that do have some survival time outside of a host. This one seems to be particularly long. So when we start talking about things like how do we combat this virus, that's one of the reasons why asymptomatic spread, not really transmitting it, is kind of a big deal. If you walk around without a mask, it's just going to all kind of harmlessly fall to the ground and die off anyways. Because unless you're an idiot and you decide to lick the floors of Walmart, you're pretty much not going to get sick from COVID, even if you had asymptomatic people or symptomatic people in the store without a mask. The problem is that the spray, if you're coughing or sneezing, that's a problem. But when we start talking about masks, one of the reasons why I caution against them is because you're basically putting a concentrator in front of your face. It catches all of your droplets. It provides a UV shielded environment for the virus to live as long as possible, and you're concentrating it as you go about your daily life. So we may actually have a case, if I have a mask on for 20 minutes, let's say, and I was emitting 1 million virus particles a minute, right? The interior of that mask is going to be coated with 20 million virus particles. And if I touch it, now I got 10 on my hands, right? 10 million, roughly. I mean, specificity there. But if I take my mask on and off, I've got 10 million on my hands. And now that 10 million, I wipe it on a surface, I've got 5, right? 5 million on my hands and 5 million on the surface. Whereas if I just sat there and breathed normally, it would all kind of harmlessly fall to the ground. And again, don't lick the floors, but, wouldn't spread as fast or as far. When we start talking about the COVID-19 virus.
Generally.
Yeah, avoid hospitals. That's a good...
If
you're in the blast zone,
you're
in a bad place.
And the worst place to have ground, basically, is a hospital.
So do not lick the floor of a hospital.
Yeah, never do that.
Very bad idea.
Like, ever. Not on a dare or anything or for money, because you could die. Like, all bullshit aside, you could get fucking MRSA and die. Oh shit, did I lose you? Uh-oh. Ah, crap. Something bad's happened. Or just the internet being screwy.
For 30 seconds or a minute or something like that through a UV channel in the box.
Hey, I lost you for just a second there.
Really?
Yeah, I have no idea what just happened. You came back in saying 30 seconds. You said don't lick the floor, and I said don't because you could die from MRSA.
Oh yeah, well MRSA will kill you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
think I can glean what you were talking about, but they actually sell those things even. Or you can buy like the finger things for like the UV lights that are used to cure nails. Like
the UVC is very effective on viruses in general. And that's because we don't have viruses don't have the lipid layer that our cells do. So they pretty much are close to unshielded DNA.
Well, not only that, they're not self-repairing.
Well, yes. Yeah, that's another issue. So when we start talking about like radiation, from a nuclear perspective, UV is like the step below X-ray. And so what ends up happening is the higher energy the photons get, the farther they can penetrate. So a virus on a surface has nothing that shields it from those photons, right? And it just basically is ripped apart immediately. Because a virus is nothing more than the absolute minimum. It's basically the most efficient organism that you could think of, right? You have nothing more than your attachment point plus your carrier package, and that's all it is. So when we start talking about UVC, this is a good thing, and this is again, I would oppose masks in general. I would oppose social distancing is kind of useful. Plus, I like having my space. But realistically, we could, with UV lights, control most of the spread of this virus over major surfaces. And that's kind of a really cool thing. And we could prevent it from HVAC systems, so we could basically eliminate most of the spread of this virus with minor upgrades to our current technology. And it's not even like major technological upgrades. It's like UV lights.
Now, here's an interesting proposition. Let's say you put one of those on, just to put it in simple terms, a string, and you lowered that down into somebody's lungs, and you were to use this light to heal. What would you call this healing light? Who knows?
Well, I think the appropriate way to call it is clearly, adding bleach to an individual's lungs, because that's what Trump got roasted for. What Evan's talking about is a very specific technology that was actually advanced, something that we could put directly into the primary place of infection. And if you illuminated that, now first off, the one thing your lung cells are not as protected as like the exterior of your skin from UV light.
They're not ever meant to be exposed to it. Basically,
they really aren't. For this. Oh, like seriously, in all seriousness, and it's outside of virus stuff, right? So if you wanted to have a bit of advice as an individual, if you're going to go spend a day at the beach, or a day in the outside world, or wherever you're going to do, you're going to spend a good amount of time in the sun. You're going to have a lot of exposure in your arms or whatever. you want to minimize the amount of soap that you use because that strips the dead layer of skin off the surface of your skin, and that actually increases your UV exposure in those areas. So you really, I'm not saying don't bathe, but in general, I very rarely use soap products. I only use it, once it gets to the point where I've got build up and I got to take care of it. But you should minimize your soap products because that strips the dead layer of skin, which makes your skin, which is actually UV tolerant, exposed to more UV rays than the dead layer of skin, which predominantly protects it. I think it's your epidermis. I think it's your epidermis.
Yeah, it's your outer layer.
Dermis. Yeah, so the outer layer is just dead stuff, and the whole purpose of that is to take the radiation. So it takes the majority of this low energy radiation hit, and if you shower and you strip it with a lot of soaps and a lot of those materials, you end up ripping that off, and you can actually get that increases your rate of skin cancer rather significantly. But when we start talking about things like your lungs, as much as I think if I was dealing with an older individual, I would happily sit there and stick a UV light in their lungs because it will eliminate this virus at a faster rate than your lungs take damage. But at the same time, you'd have to limit the exposure to the lung tissue because the lung tissue is not geared towards defending against UV light.
Absolutely. But, by that same token, as I had just said a minute ago, the human body is a self-repairing mechanism.
It is.
It contains self-repairing mechanisms.
It is.
So it can fix these things. And if we're looking at a 30-second exposure, not the worst. Certainly not something you want.
No.
But considering your other options, infertility, the fact that it directly crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Yep.
Everything else we know about this thing. Yeah, maybe better safe than sorry.
And this is, what Evan is referencing is a technology company that got all of its ads pulled down by YouTube because Trump turned around and talked about putting disinfecting agent into the lungs. And everybody wanted to talk about how it was bleach and how it was dangerous, but the reality is this was actually part of it was this company that proposed putting UV lights within the lungs as a technological thing, and then that would be a means of disinfecting the lungs during a virus outbreak. It's actually a really cool idea. I totally support it. There is also articles out there that have proposed hitting people with X-rays, chest X-rays, with COVID-19.
Fair.
Because a chest X-ray. Yeah, well, I mean, it introduces enough ionizing radiation.
Oh yeah, you're going to spread the DNA of a virus that works on basically spreading its DNA.
Yep, and you'd have a minor, what is it, 100? It's like 100. I have to look up exactly what it is, but it's really not much. You have almost no
about as much as you get on a flight.
Yeah, just about. That's about accurate. I think it's roughly like 100 millirem. Is roughly what it is, or 50 millirem, or something like that.
Okay.
Imaging technology, like they're able to, as time has gone on, the imaging, like the ability to capture the image through the X-ray has improved dramatically, which means that they need lower doses to make it through in order to get, an appropriate image or a high quality image. But either way, you're still talking about a very low thing, and it would basically instantly eliminate most of the virus in the system. So if you turned around and periodically gave people a chest X-ray who were in the middle of a very bad infection of COVID, you could potentially, this is hypothetical because they don't really do these kinds of studies, but you could potentially start wiping out the virus. What's that? Yeah.
It's the scariest thing in the world.
Sure it is.
Godzilla,
right, absolutely.
Didn't you know?
I wish. I really wish. You give me the iguana that turns into an eye laser bearing, fire breathing awesomeness, and I will quit my job and start raising these lizards.
So you're saying you're looking for work with a Mr. Anton Arcane, I hear.
Yeah, I am. I am indeed.
Well, you heard the man, Dr. Arcane. If you're looking for people for your Swamp Thing lab, hit me up. I'll get you in touch. Hit the man up directly.
If you're also, if you can find a way to get gamma radiation to make me angry and cause that to, basically turn it vulnerable and beat the crap out of other people, I'm all for that kind of research.
No, we don't support violence on this podcast, so I don't know if I can get behind all that.
It's not violence. I'd only be violent against people who deserve it.
Oh.
Like space
gods.
Well,
that's fine. That's totally fine. I mean, as long as you're doing it to the people that deserve it, I mean, it's completely morally acceptable.
That's right.
Now,
gamma radiation, folks, just turns you green. That's all it does. It gives you super strength, makes you invulnerable, and turns you green.
Now, you know what? That's a really good segue into something that's completely on topic. So, here out of...
Wait.
Yeah?
Superheroes as a result of gamma radiation?
Well, no, not that specifically. More
That's
the...
not wrong.
Whatever. Anyway, I'm going to link you here. From MedExpress, studies find having COVID-19 may prevent reinfection. God forbid.
From the no shit Sherlock department.
Yeah,
comes this.
But, this is coming from about as unwoke or completely woke, depending on how you define it, source. As mainstream a source as you can ask for, is telling us what we already knew, but at least they're actually telling us, as opposed to saying what the WHO is, that you have to take a vaccine to get herd immunity. What are you talking about, you silly head?
So the first key point that we have to talk about here is, why is it that COVID-19 you might not be protected from a standard infection? Why is that belief existing? And I think that's actually its own separate subject. But realistically, our tests are kind of shitty for COVID-19.
The
they
PCR
have
test is garbage.
Yes. Well, I think the PCR test is pretty good. The problem is that they don't limit their cycle times, so you end up So PCR basically concentrates the DNA of the virus. It forces it to replicate.
Okay,
so
I should say the PCR test as utilized is garbage.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably true. So you basically, the PCR goes through a certain number of cycles, and once it goes through a certain number of cycles, it's concentrated to a certain amount. So if you go through an unlimited cycle time, which is kind of what they've been doing,
not
and they're getting
unlimited, because we actually did cover this before. They're apparently doing 30 to 40 times.
30 to 40, yeah.
What would normally be done.
Right. So if you're talking about that kind of concentration
factor, it's an order
factor,
of magnitude or two higher than the level.
Several times. So the standard tests are closer to 15 cycles, and they're running it for 30 to 45 cycles. Now there's a financial incentive to run that test for 30 to 45 cycles, which I think we've linked in the past. If you get a positive COVID result, the hospital gets to charge so much more to the federal government for you. But at the same time, when we start talking about the reinfection rates, the tests are garbage, right? A lot of the initial tests that we were doing back in March and February had 50+% false positives or false negative rates. So what ended up happening is we would clear people, and they weren't actually clear of the infection, and then we performed the test again 2 weeks later, and what do you know? It's still kicking around in their system. Right, and so the obviously, in the most brilliant of possibilities, it's not that you still have some virus left over, it's that clearly you got reinfected, and that was kind of what they ended up doing. So the suspicion has always been that if you get infected with COVID, that you can't get infected with COVID again. But, now we're starting to actually do the studies with more intensive testing and more reliable testing that's finding out that, actual traditional immunity strategies do work against this thing.
Now, that being said, too, I've got another article here, again, out of MedExpress, but this comes from the Queen Mary University of London, out of a legitimate study. This is actually published just 4 days ago. So we have, hard data on it. Study finds evidence of lasting immunity after mild or asymptomatic COVID infection. And the implication being that a more severe infection, of course, you'll obviously develop that. But that is to say, even your mild and asymptomatic cases are developing this herd immunity.
No, that doesn't exist according to the World Health Organization. You're lying. Don't lie to the poor people. The World Health Organization knows all. China is your overlords. I mean, what am I saying? The yen, that's what we want to go for, or whatever the Chinese currency is. I think it's
well,
yen.
Xi Jinping uses the yuan.
Is it yuan?
Mm-hmm.
That's all right.
Yeah,
My bad.
it's either the yuan or jars of honey. I can't remember.
I'm a big fan of jars of honey.
Well, who isn't? I mean,
They are fantastic smoking recipe for anybody who actually smokes stuff. Take some salmon, cover it with a little bit of kosher salt, a little bit of honey. It's fantastic. We raise our own bees, so we have a lot of excess honey, and this is a very good use of the honeys.
Oh.
But, it doesn't really surprise me that people found evidence of long-lasting immunity after mild or asymptomatic infection. I don't even understand why, why people turned around and said, oh my god, if your immune system is able to fend this virus off, clearly you have a problem, instead of, if your immune system is able to fend this virus off after, a mild infection or an asymptomatic infection, then that means that you're pretty much good against it already. I don't even understand why this was even debated.
Yeah,
I really
it's
don't.
One of those really ridiculous things, like how the hell are we even asking these questions today?
Right. This is like psychological research on like human development type stuff. It's just it doesn't.
Yeah, if you've ever played the Fallout series and you're familiar with Vault Tech, it kind of feels like we're all living in a bit of a vault these days.
That's all you. I played Fallout for I got out of the vault. That's the farthest I made it.
The long and short of it is, basically, the vaults were all Tuskegee Airmen experiments of some variety or another. Yeah. And I'll say, it kind of feels like that. Oh, and I have some really, really sad and or bad news. I think no, I didn't link it to you. I'll do that right now. But it appears that our ancestors, the Neanderthals, I've got some bad news. COVID-19 might have wiped them out too. That's how dangerous this is. It reached its deadly viral fist deep into our past and murdered those poor Neanderthals.
So first off, we need to talk a little bit, because this thing says that we replaced it using our sharp tongues and quick, delicate minds. That's not the Neanderthals and humans coexisted at the same time. We evolved from the same kind of species. The Neanderthal line sent off early into basically the European subcontinent and kind of did its thing there. Neanderthals were they were the equivalent of fucking dwarves, right? So if you're familiar with fantasy genre or D&D lore or whatever, right, they had a constitution, they had more hit points than your average human. Like, way more hit points. Pretty much, there's no Neanderthal skeleton that we don't find where they basically have nothing but broken bones and dislocated joints. They had very high pain tolerances. They had very high ability to recover from physical damage. But what they didn't have is they didn't have the ability to vocalize like humans did. It's not that they were dumber than humans, they just couldn't vocalize as well as we could, because one of our key evolutionary traits is our ability to modify speech. Like every word that is coming out of my mouth, my very drunk mouth, but my mouth at this point in time is it requires a complex shaping of the mouth, plus tongue placement and modulation of my vocal cords, and that is what produces human speech. And they weren't capable of producing some aspect of that. So it is very likely that we lived alongside Neanderthals. Based on DNA tests, we actually interbred with them. Likely for the same reason that half-dwarfs have to exist, because if you have those plucky Scottish individuals who are very good with their axe and very good at taking out orcs, then why wouldn't you breed with them? But this whole, like, could COVID-19 have wiped out the Neanderthals? Seriously? No.
Yeah, what this is, first and foremost, is actually headline malfeasance at its finest. Because
yes, it is.
What they're actually saying here is that some individuals who have these Neanderthal markers and carryover genes and that sort of thing are at a higher risk from COVID, which, there's any number of ways this could have been said that would not make the writer sound like an absolute flaming idiot.
Keep in mind, right, we've had a pandemic for about a year, maybe a little bit longer than that. And since then, we have, 2 known variations in it? Viruses mutate at an incredible rate of speed. Neanderthals have been extinct for many thousands of years. In the period of time, there's no COVID-19, which could have actually infected them.
Yeah, never mind there was no China and no Wuhan lab number 5.
Well, let's ignore that possibility. That's not true, right? There's no proof that this came out of a lab. It just really looks
No,
like
there's just evidence.
There's a lot of evidence, but no proof that it came out of a Chinese lab. But yeah, I mean, realistically, let's make the assumption that this virus is completely and totally natural, which is possible. Like,
okay,
you start talking about the Wuhan. The Wuhan lab was investigating coronaviruses in bats. That was predominantly what they were trying to do to prove on a world stage that they were capable of doing so, right? And let's ignore the fact
research thereon, but that's not important to the task.
Sure, not important to the task. And there's the possibility that the lab techs needed to make a little bit extra money, and so they sold a few of their research animals on the wet market.
And, not to accuse anyone in China of doing anything corrupt. It's not like they have that kind of reputation or anything. So, moving on.
They are all innocent and beautiful individuals in their own right. That's what we know.
We have to respect their culture.
Then we do. It would be terrible not to. But at the end of the day, if we assume that COVID-19 is entirely 100% natural, it is so varied from what would have been around for viruses those days that it would be impractical to say, could COVID-19 have wiped out the Neanderthals? Right? Even if we just discovered this virus.
Absolutely, yes, it would probably destroy anything that had an immune system any more than 100 years older than ours.
Maybe. Maybe it would have. Maybe not.
Yeah, true. Humans are incredibly plastic and quite
we are. And when we start talking about, like, where are these infection rates really hitting, we seem to have a huge difference in outcomes on, blood types. We have a huge difference in outcomes on race. We have a huge difference in outcomes on socioeconomic status. And all of those different traits that make up those different categories, seem to have an interplay with this disease. So I just don't think we could make that kind of, it wiped out an entire species claim, because realistically, even the Black Death, right, bubonic plague, as it were, wiped out something like 80+% of Europe's population. And you know what, people like me, and Evan, I'm assuming you're a pretty white dude, but I'm like pure white. There's like no nothing. I thought coming from New England, I thought I had Native American DNA, just like Pocahontas, and and turns out I actually don't. I am one of the few New Englanders who does not have any Native American heritage whatsoever. There is 0% of my DNA which is Native American, right? But you even start talking about something like that, where we're just talking about Europe with bubonic plague. 80% of people were wiped out, and the rest of us had immunity. Anybody who comes from Europe has, a significantly higher chance of surviving bubonic plague than, somebody taken from an area outside of Europe, because of how prevalent it was. And anybody who survives with their immune system intact in that Neanderthal group would have continued to bred, and it would have impacted the humans that came to their area just as much as it would the Neanderthals. So I don't even understand where these guys are coming from. They're so out of whack with reality. I'm sure they're trying to make the argument that maybe a virus wiped out Neanderthals, but realistically, based on all the evidence that we had, it looks like humans just outcompeted them. We were able to maintain a stronger society, a larger tribal group, and a lot of that has to do with our language ability. The Neanderthals were stronger. They were at least as smart as we were, but they were just not as expressive. And it's not they were idiots. They just physically couldn't speak.
Well, to the same degree, anyway.
Well, I mean, you take a look at like gorillas, right? You have Coco the gorilla, which was what I mean, she's passed on now, which is a shame. But we can teach gorillas language and complex concepts and all of this other stuff associated. We can teach elephants math and art and all of these other things. Most animals can learn a significant proportion of the knowledge that we have, but that doesn't mean they're physically capable of speaking the language or learning those language skills. So even though we can teach them a language, it has to be done with their ability to communicate. And humans have an ability to vocalize, which is basically unsurpassed by almost all other animals.
Yeah,
maybe a handful of parrots.
Absolutely amazing.
They really are. They're stunning. Not just our vocal cords, but our whole vocal tract. Let me see if I can find the. There's actually a really cool app that allows you to learn how amazing it really is.
But that being said, there's actually quite a few bonobos that, you can carry on a conversation. I mean, it's a conversation with a kid, but you can actually carry on a conversation with them.
Yes.
And they're one of the fewer primates out there that you can actually do that with.
Yes.
And, I mean, you don't have to sign to them. Most of them actually use a speech board anymore because it's kind of easier.
I mean, that's kind of the thing, is that we can teach a lot of animals. I mean, dogs can actually learn something. They can hold vocabularies up into the couple hundreds of words. And that's
I think dogs are in a couple hundred words. I think you can teach a cat, I've heard, at least 75 words.
The problem that you're going to have with cats is that you might be able to teach them 1,000 words, but they will refer to the ones that they give a shit about. But if you, so I just linked in chat a really cool thing that actually talks about, basically, if you click this is an app, and you can fiddle with it, and it is literally our entire speech synthesis thing, if you go into this.
I'll put that in the
it's
Showlinks.
Really cool.
Check it
You
out.
should. It's pretty cool. So you change basically the contraction of all of these different things, and you can make different sounds. If you could do this faster with a mouse and keyboard than you could, speaking, then you'd be able to produce actual language.
Fascinating.
It is pretty cool.
And excuse me. So, with that, there was something else we were talking about too before this, which I don't really have a good segue, so I'll just go into it. Carbon. And,
yes.
And I'll go ahead and present my incredibly novel carbon sequestration method. I think this is going to change the game. I think this is going to be completely revolutionary. People aren't going to know how to handle this. So what we do is we take all this shit that, holds carbon really well. Like, for instance, in a previous one, we were talking about used up milk that's not getting used. Okay. We take this milk, we put it in a container, and we burn everything around it. So we burn out all the liquids and all the oxygen, and we're left with charcoal. And then we take that charcoal and we put it in the ground. Well, that's pretty goddamn stable. So it's going to stay that way for a while and add good carbon to everything in the earth. Be good for all the plants. It's perfect. And we can do this with our extra trees, our extra sawdust, all these things. Game changer. Pay me money.
So there's some truth to that. We can actually produce charcoal. It's one of the most useful and ancient cooking fuels that human beings have. And the reason that we have this is it doesn't really rot. It produces a pretty stable temperature. It's wonderful as a cooking fuel, low emissions. And this is when you start talking about like the loss of the rainforests, that's where a lot of it's going. It's going to basically producing charcoal. And all they do is to produce charcoal is they start a fire and then they smother it. And then they let it sit for a really, really long time and it burns out the hydrogen and leaves basically pure carbon, which you can then at any point burn with oxygen, or you can mix it in with soil. It does a whole bunch of other things. But when we start talking about carbon capture is a really amazing. So the hippies used to turn around and try to make the argument that we have to sit there and move away from fossil fuels. And even as a nuclear guy, I hate fossil fuel companies. They are constantly, they're undermining nuclear energy as much as anybody else is. The environmentalists and useful liberals, as useful idiots as they may be, are doing this stuff. But the oil and gas companies are really the funding source for a lot of the anti-nuclear activities. When we start talking about carbon capture, their argument was always that the reason that we have to move off carbon was that it was not cost effective to do carbon capture. And the only way that they proposed to do this was to basically take a saltwater well in the middle of the desert and then pump carbon into it and then cap it at high pressure. And that would seem to be very expensive because A, you're having to recapture carbon dioxide, so you have to distill the carbon dioxide out of the air. Then you have to dump it down into the well, and then you have to pressurize and cap it, and oh god, no, it could always explode and escape. But carbon capture actually applies to a broad series of technologies which take carbon and transform it into more useful forms. And there's a variety of different ways that they could do this. What Evan is talking about is charcoal, and that's certainly an option. But we also have a variety of other proposed mechanisms for doing carbon capture that have come out in the last couple of years that would not just allow us to do something like charcoal, but would allow us to actually start producing independent fuel sources. So one of them is actually I think it's like a sodium electrode, and you could actually produce, based on CO2, a small battery that would actually run on CO2 infused water, and it would consume, the electrode and the anode, and we get electric charge out of it, and that'd be one option. Another thing is jet fuel.
Just linked up an article in the chat on that came up just recently on the topic. I'll have that for everybody as well to look up here.
There are actually a lot of proposals, one of which was actually sent off to the Navy, and I think I saw an article saying they were working on, which would allow us to use our nuclear reactors to basically take in a stream of seawater, and the seawater would be, ionized to separate out the hydrogen, and we could produce hydrogen fuel on one stream, and then we could actually produce jet fuel on the other stream, because it would come directly out of the seawater. And this is a really cool concept of how we could use some nuclear energy integration in our fuel systems. But this is one of the things when we start talking about carbon capture or alternatives to renewable. Why is it that we need to do renewable energy? The short answer is that carbon capture is likely to produce profitable industries that can take the carbon out at a minimal energy cost and basically sell it back cheaper than what we can pull it out of the ground for. And at that point, these would be zero carbon industries. It's kind of a cool idea.
So in that, you linked up a paper to me, Empirically Constrained Climate Sensitivity and the Social Cost of Carbon.
I did.
Which, if the title alone kind of hurts your brain, it kind of should. Because this is, a lot of the science around this is kind of not what you're told. So you did a really good job of explaining this, so I'll just go ahead and leave you to it.
So I'll just to try to keep this consistent, we'll post it all to the staff chat channel or whatever.
Yeah. And I
So
found a copy of this paper that I'll be able to link for everybody to download.
Awesome.
Yeah,
so this one of the first things that we have to debate is the economics associated with climate change, right? And this is one of the things that every single time somebody has said that they want to grab me for a debate against somebody who's pro climate change and I'm anti climate change or whatever you want to, I'm a skeptic, and somebody else who's endorsing kind of the mainstream view. And the first thing they say is, what is the list of topics? This is how these debates go, right? You see somebody who wants to do a kill stream, you want to see somebody who wants to get in with somebody else, and they're going to talk about a subject that is either politically contentious or whatever. They want to know what topics you're willing to talk about. And the first one that I ever turned around and did is that I want to talk about the data, and they said, yep, that's fine. We'll talk about the data. You can debate the data. And this was actually going to be set up with Potholer54. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. But there was a guy who wanted to set me up with Potholer54, and I would challenge him there. And he said, pick 3 topics that you're going to go through. One was going to be the data. The second one was going to be the risk analysis. And the third one that I wanted to talk about was the economics of climate change. And this gets thrown out every single time. When we start talking about economics of climate change, and for people who don't understand what this is making sure that we do not spend $10 on a $1 problem. Right? You generally don't want to spend more solving a problem than the problem is worth. And so that's what the economics of climate change is. And I started doing some
basically
research
cost-benefit analysis.
It is cost-benefit analysis. That's really what it comes down to. And you can consider the proposed actions on climate as costing somewhere between $40 to $50 per ton of CO2 that's mitigated. So if we stop a ton of CO2 in order... What is going on? I've got a whole bunch of tabs open, and one of them is producing sound. And it just really kind of irritated me.
Well,
Sorry
I don't have
about
anything
that.
coming through, so...
I am very good. Very, very happy with that. I closed the tab, and then it continued to do that. So I think it was the thing that I linked to earlier about how to change sound outputs. But it's very, very irritating when I think that we should be able to show up to any office of any individual internet company that has auto-playing sound ads. We should be able to show up to their office building with a howitzer and just fire it off, because I find that equally annoying. I think that should be legally applicable
that
to
contains,
go hunt down
obviously fireworks that
fireworks, yes,
that show our displeasure and
indeed,
do no
fireworks,
real damage.
artillery shells, small nuclear devices, literally anything that would anybody who plays ads automatically with an actual vocal component. But going back to the topic, so this is what we're talking about is cost-benefit analysis. And this, when somebody was gonna set me up with Potholer54, who is one of the more popular YouTubers, this was ruled out immediately. They would not accept if I mentioned cost-benefit analysis, the whole thing was off. So guess what? I said, I'm not, I can't really go into this with 3 topics if you're just going to ignore one of them, which is kind of the biggest deal. So one of the earliest articles that you can talk to about the cost-benefit analysis is, or one of the most recent ones that I've seen is this 2017 article from the Washington Post, which argues that the Trump administration has significantly recalculated what's known as the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon is basically trying to put a dollar figure on the how much damage is a ton of carbon dioxide going to do when it is emitted to the environment. And the Washington Post article argues that the Trump administration has significantly deviated from the norms by dropping the previous estimate from $45 to $1 to $6 in the year 2020. So the question that you need to ask is, which of those 2 estimates is out of line with historical precedent? And so the question is Trump turning around and sitting there and basically lowballing the cost associated with carbon, or was the Obama administration highballing the cost of carbon? And it turns out that we actually, if the Washington Post had felt like doing its fucking job, but it never does because they're journalists rather than, anything that actually matters, they could have gone back and found out the answer to their own question here.
The Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post?
The Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post. Turns out they didn't do their job. They didn't go back and actually look at documentation. If you do, you'll find that there is in 2013, which is about a year or so after the original White House working group cost of, I guess it's not that, it's July, and the May 2013 White House working group on the social cost of carbon produced an article. And there was a Senate testimony hearing that sat there and said, hey, we'll actually take a look at what these costs are and how they calculated it, and turns out that they deviate significantly from historical precedent. So what the Obama White House did was they said that we're going to use something called the discount rate. And so anybody who is, if you want to understand what the discount rate is, it's kind of like interest in reverse. So where if you take out a loan from somebody, you say, I'm going to take out $10,000 right now, the interest on that loan is the percentage that you would pay going forward into the future every year on the remaining balance that you have. Most people are familiar with loans. Social discounting is the opposite. Let's say I had a cost that I had to pay 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. How much should I have to invest today to avert that cost? And that's what social discounting is. So what the Obama administration put out in 2013 was they put out discount rates of 2.5, 3, and 5%. And the problem that you have is that in order to hit their goal of, regulating carbon dioxide, they would need to show that the approximate social cost of carbon was around $40 to $50. If it's not $40 to $50, the alternatives cost more than the CO2 emissions themselves do. Essentially, it's cheaper to run coal plants at full bore with no emissions controls than it is to sit there and put up solar panels. That's really what the cost breakdown runs down into. Now, nuclear plants are a little bit more expensive than coal plants, but they also have zero emissions, so that's one of the reasons why I advocate that technology. It's about a 10 to 20% more expensive than traditional coal plants, but none of the externalities associated with it. But in any case,
not only that, you're also working with a much more abundant resource too.
Yes. Well, actually, so it turns out the coal, we actually have many hundreds of years of coal left. Because we keep on finding those reserves. The downside is that some of the best coal we have with the least emissions controls comes out of, I think, the Dakotas. And that's just it's like straight carbon. It's beautiful stuff. It doesn't have any of the sulfur compounds. It has really low mercury. It's just a really high quality coal. So we don't need to put in as many emissions controls things, so it's more expensive than traditional coal, but at the same time it's, there's a lot of it. And we found more in Australia, we found more, China's got some reserves, but they can't really extract them at the rate that their population needs for their current growth. So they tend to pull it from Australia, they tend to pull it from the US. That's where a lot of our coal ends up going is to China. Yes. At the end of the day, nuclear technology is overall better because we mitigate the environmental hazards almost completely. It has almost no negative effects on the environment. It is an abundant resource for coal. We've got 600 years of coal reserves. We've got something like 10,000 years of uranium reserves. And if we switch over to thorium, we'll probably be pretty close to the heat death of the universe by the time that we run out of our thorium reserves, especially when you consider the other technological advancements that are going on around us. So there's just a ton of energy in nuclear fuels. If we go to fusion, which would be burning hydrogen, we would have.
Then there's without even going off-world, there's. I wouldn't even know where to begin the calculations on that. There's
It is rather tremendous. We have a lot of stuff on the planet that can produce all the energy that we need and then some, with none of the environmental impacts of a lot of hydrocarbon resources and actually none of the expenses associated with some of the more unique means of acquiring that. But in any case, so in order to prove that we need to invest in alternative energy sources, you need to hit between $40 and $50 price per ton. And that's what it was in circa 2013. So what did the Obama administration do? They produced discount rates of 2.5, 3, and 5%. And to give you an idea of the difference between these rates, at 2.5% discount rate, the social cost of carbon is around $65. The 3%, future discount rate is roughly $43. So either of those are perfectly acceptable to the goal of, mitigating carbon. But the 5% average is roughly $12. Well, why does that matter? Well, it turns out that if you go to a previous article, the Obama administration in circular, I think it's A004, sits there and talks specifically about the discount rate that has to be used. And the discount rate that has to be used is based off of an OMB document from 1994, and it says that they need to use a 7% discount rate. Turns out that they didn't even produce a 7% discount rate. They're supposed to use 3 and 7, to be more specific. They did produce a 3% discount rate, but they didn't produce a 7% discount rate. And the question is, why didn't they do that? Because if you put in carbon dioxide costs at 5%, it's like $12 per ton. If you go to 7%, it drops into the couple of bucks a ton range and might actually go negative depending on which of the models you use. Now you pause for a moment, you go, which models do we use? This is one of the issues that both Craig and I have talked about, associated models. It really is garbage in, garbage out. So your assumptions will determine whether your model is negative always for CO2 inputs, or you can sit there and take a look at things like positive, crop yields or overall, population growth, reduction in costs associated with heating, cooling systems, those kinds of things. And so that will actually decrease your overall negative impacts by adding positive impacts in there as well. I think it's the DICE model that does that. I'd have to take a look at each one. But either way, we don't hit our social cost of carbon estimates. We don't hit the social cost of carbon being what it needs to be in order to implement alternative energy strategies unless we're at 3% and above, or 3% and below, future discount rates. And in reality, according to the previous documentation that we have, it's supposed to be at a 7% discount rate, which when we do that, it drops it down from something like $40 some odd per ton to a rather inconvenient $2 to $3 per ton.
Well,
at which point it's not worth actually. It is pretty substantial. But that's because the effects of climate change, even if we take everything at face value, right, with the worst case scenarios that we have, the negative impacts are multiple hundreds of years into the future. And so, how much are you willing to pay for this goes back into I will gladly pay you for a hamburger today. I will gladly pay you tomorrow for a hamburger today. How much is the actual future costs? Are they worth today? And the answer is very little. The other thing that they were supposed to do is sit there and only evaluate the costs of impacts to the United States, because essentially, if we're evaluating, if assuming we're in a global economy and everybody's burning carbon, and we talk about the impacts to China versus the United States kind of thing, and it has an impact over here that doesn't have an impact over here, then what's the value in us paying the cost for a benefit somebody else receives, right? And that's really like it's an ethics thing, and it's certainly debatable. But if you don't include that, it skyrockets the cost. So this Washington Post article sits there and talks about the Trump administration changing all of these things. But what I actually linked in the chat and what I think Evan has is documentation that indicates that going back all the way to 1994. We had an alternative method of accounting for environmental impacts of, regulated constituents. And then all of a sudden the Obama administration had a specific target that they had to meet. And they dropped the requirements that they originally proposed for calculating these cost-benefit analyses, because the cost-benefit analyses didn't ultimately pan out to support the policy decisions and policy advocacy they were going for on a future basis. So this comes down to the economics of climate change, and realistically it's just a series of documents that you are free to dig through and find out that, yes, in fact, these are all government sources, by the way. These are not like, something I produced on my own or something like that. These are all government source documents that show that we should have done this, and if we do it with this, the end result is that it's not cost effective to deal with climate change using alternative energy sources.
Kind of unsurprising too. I mean, as much as I really do support a lot of these alternative sources because they allow for a certain level of mobility. If you can have a standalone power source in a place, that's one less thing you have to worry about. If you can just put a solar roof on a house and drop it anywhere, that really changes how you can build cities and how you can do anything, how you can do science, how you can do industry.
I see. The problem that you have is that at best you're going to be basically able to, for a single family house, right? You'll be able to produce their energy costs for like running their TV and the other stuff. You're never going to be able to get to the point where solar on a roof is going to cover your steelmaking industry. The energy requirements are so intense.
No. I mean, honestly, it doesn't scale to industrial grade, but as far as like retail and urban, it's pretty reasonable. I mean, you could drop a small city with no real industrial capabilities on solar and wind with battery backup.
Well, yes and no. So
in the
you
right
can
area
and you
too.
can't.
I mean, you couldn't just drop it in the wrong place and expect it to work, but you could put things down a lot faster and easier.
So fundamentally, the problem that you have always with these sources is we can do something, but should we really do that thing in that way? So when we start talking about something like solar and wind, that's kind of the appeal that it has, is everybody's like, oh, we could do this. But as soon as you start talking the battery backup, that's where the costs really come in. So the problem with solar and wind, well, specifically solar, let's go with, you get about 4 hours at your nameplate capacity on a good day. On a bad day, you get like 10% of your overall capacity. On your good day, you get like 30% of your overall capacity. So you get about 4 hours at maximum capacity, and then you get another 8 hours on the other side of it at kind of like half capacity, and then you're pretty much done. So you get roughly about an 8-hour cycle worth of energy out of your solar cells. And then when you start talking about trying to deal with your battery backup, the cost of batteries is so high in comparison to the amount of energy that they can feed into the system that they're just not, they're never really cost effective. So I'm all for alternative energy sources, but realistically, like, I could turn around, if you wanted to drop a city out of nowhere, there's no reason why we couldn't do something like a small modular reactor.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, I don't have the story offhand, but I mean, there was a Boy Scout that built one in a woodshed recently. And then
there's a lot more myth than reality to that, but there is, to give you an idea, right? So a 10 kilowatt power plant capability, right, which is roughly about what would feed about 2 houses, is roughly what I think it comes out to be. A 10 kilowatt power plant that feeds 2 houses or 2 households is roughly about the size of a John Deere tractor, John Deere riding tractor, right? It's not a really big thing. We can produce those with very, very, very tiny.
So about the size of 5 Tesla Powerwalls.
Probably, yeah. That's probably about right.
I know, probably about 7. You'd have to stack them a little weird.
You'd also have to include the solar panels on the roof. And by the way, that would output for comfortably. And this is a real reactor.
Actual physical space requirements. It would be about that many Powerwalls.
Yes, it would be significantly larger than...
No, it would be a lot of Powerwalls and a lot of solar to put out that much actual power on a consistent basis.
And it really comes down to be roughly about the same size as a John Deere tractor. In fact, I have seen a reactor that does this. These were off-the-shelf things that you could buy from GE back in the 1960s and 70s, and with the Carter administration, we basically killed a lot of this nuclear innovation, which would produce small modular reactors that you could basically, if you had the land, say, you could start a small city off of, and it would run consistently for the entire period of time at peak wattage. And that's kind of a shame.
Yeah,
but that's,
I've got to be honest, I wouldn't mind seeing a return to generators in general, because, I mean, we're starting to hit the wall of what batteries can really do with our material science as it is.
I mean, from a material science and a cost perspective.
Fair.
Like, we turned around and what was it, Tesla did their battery days, and all the usual players come out and they're like, oh, look at how awesome Tesla is, they're reducing costs by this much, that much, and the next thing. And at the end of the day, if you look at it from, if you strip away the bullshit, one, they've decided that battery technology is not advancing any further because they're going after process improvements. Nothing wrong with process improvements. You can get significant savings out of process improvements, but technological improvements gain the advantage without having to do all these process improvements. And process improvements, you kind of get like a one and done thing. So Tesla's battery days, they drop the cost dramatically, but, and here's the big but, it's all through like manufacturing processes. And when you start taking a look at the battery cost curves, and some, I saw somebody say, oh, well, look, it's dropped like 60 to 70% over these years. It dropped like 60 to 70% between like 2014 and 2015 or 2015 and 2016. And it's been pretty much flat since then with no actual drops in cost per kilowatt hour. Like that's one of the problems is batteries are just not, they are never getting to this idyllic state they keep on promising.
Well, pretty much, a really good analogy for batteries is where we are with an internal combustion engine that runs on standard gasoline. We're basically at the point now where it's just refinements in the process and little tweaks. There's not much more you can do. I'm not talking about E85. That stuff is magic juice. You can do stupid things with E85. But, with standard gasoline, again, like the standard procedure that you've got, without going to some new material, we're about at the line. It's just refinements and a couple percent points here and there now. So we really are going to have to look at something. And that's kind of where it is.
Like, we're not going to see these major reductions. And whenever I see people go, oh, well, look, solar panels came down this much over what they did over the past 10 years, or batteries came down this much over the last 10 years. That's true. And then if you take a look at their cost curves, most of that happened in like a year, maybe 2 years over the last 10, and then it's been pretty much flat since then. So you can't expect this major cost reduction to continue on forward.
Now,
and at best, you're going to have is these process improvements.
Yeah, but with that being the case, we might find that E85 for batteries, that magic formula that makes that perfect lithium polymer that doesn't degrade as quickly, that, has millions of cycles in its life as opposed to thousands. But that's not exactly where we are, and we don't know if we're going to get there tomorrow or the next day.
But,
so you have to kind of plan for what's available.
I have extreme skepticism when it comes to the renewable energy stuff. And that's just not just because it's competitive to my own personal industry. Obviously take my bias aside.
Remember to smoke cigarettes, kid.
The same promises that I see hyped today on solar and wind and batteries are the exact same thing that when I was in kindergarten, whatever those cheapo, like, newsprinter things that they would have, they were talking about the same theoretical advancements in technologies as they're talking about today. And they have never gotten at-scale production of these things. So we basically have a whole bunch of people who come out every couple of years and reinvent the same technology, and then find out that it's not viable on a market scale. but they produce their paper. It gets a really great, article highlight, and everybody's like, oh yeah, look at this great thing. When in reality, it never actually goes in. And that's been my experience with renewables. That's been my experience with batteries. And I would caution anybody who sits there and thinks they're going to have this great technological breakthrough. They've been talking about having a great technological breakthrough for years. And about the only breakthrough that they've had, realistically speaking, is mass production. And that was, 1 year, 2 year kind of breakthroughs that they get from those. So
And
that's been my experience with them.
Well, that and also that really in and of itself is just a higher level process refinement.
Right.
And with that, I've pretty much covered everything that I wanted to go over this week. I know it's not the longest show, but is there anything else you were wanting to go over? Because aside from that, it's all been politics, and I don't necessarily feel like getting into that right now. I
am really happy to avoid politics as much as possible. I haven't seen anything really interesting, politics-wise. I'm kind of glad that we had the holiday break. It was fantastic. I didn't spend time on Twitter and the cesspit that is social media.
Because it's not been fun.
Really?
No. But that's for another
too
time.
bad. You know what? That's all right. I was kind of hoping to see those fraud studies or the fraud stuff go somewhere, but it never did. I know that cases went approximately nowhere.
No. There's actually
cases.
There's another case that's actually going before the Supreme Court before the 6th, out of Pennsylvania.
Really?
Yeah, regarding the constitutionality. It has been put
really?
on the docket.
I didn't think. I thought they shot that one down.
Oh, this is another one, and it has not been shot down. It has been docketed.
Really?
We'll see what happens, but it is on the docket. There's so much going on all sides, as well as this COVID stimulus bill. And
oh my God! Yeah, that's a whole separate kettle of fish.
It really is.
I'm a libertarian. I've been a libertarian for a while, and that's because the first time I ever got a paycheck, I realized how much taxes, and I actually went back to my employer and said, you must have paid me wrong because there's no way this many taxes came out of my paycheck. And then you sit there, you trace it, you find out where your actual tax money goes, and it's very disheartening. And I'm kind of excited that the stimulus bill went over as a leaded balloon as I would have liked any one of these other spending bills to have gone over.
It has so much pork, you could say that it is legion.
You know what? We'd have to go to our resident Jew and find out what he thought about it.
Well, I'm sure he would say that it's not kosher.
I bet you he would too. That's probably the exact words that he would use.
Well, I don't think I could pick a perfect sign-off more than that one, so... Everybody, be well. Keep your head right and keep your powder dry. We'll talk to you soon.
Have a good night.